My dear friends, this is not a sermon. This will be a very short or perhaps long talk. Many of you have asked me lately to explain the paintings in this church. So I ask you, don't get impatient.
Sit in the pews of any church painted by Gregory De Wit, and you'll find that it's easy to get overwhelmed. The vibrant colors and powerful symbols leave the viewer with much to take in. Upon first glance, much of his work seems timeless and traditional. But take a closer look, and you'll find that his work is actually daringly contemporary. It's laced with anachronism, social commentary, and often even subtle humor. Most of his artwork is well received today, but it wasn't always so.
Some people liked it very, very much. Other people hated it very, very much. And there were not too many people in between.
Most of Gregory's work has to be understood in full context. So typical of Catholic churches are just series of little devotions spattered throughout a church. That didn't make any sense to Gregory. The church is one canvas, and he wants to tell this huge story that needs to be told.
His artwork has been criticized for its flaws, extra-biblical narrative, and bucking of traditional execution.
I will not praise my own work, but that I can say, that it came of the depth of my soul.
His painting and his faith were the same thing for him. Painting was a way of praying, and he prayed constantly.
Like the art he created, the story of Dom Gregory's life is marked by colorful moments, ironic details, and surprising humor.
People think of Gregory as an artist, but he was also a great linguist. He spoke German, his native Dutch, of course. He spoke French, and he spoke English, but he was also a fine theologian and a good preacher.
Through accounts of his life, examination of his artwork, and a conversation with his last remaining friend, we'll paint a portrait of the man behind the art. Before he took the name Gregory, Jan Aloysius De Wit was born in the Netherlands on June 9, 1892.
Well, he came from a town that even today is considered a kind of an arts center, Hilversum. Stories that I've heard about him, he talked about having had an interest in art from early years, that someone gave him a watercolor set when he was quite young.
De Wit's father was a fabric designer. As a child, Jan would spend his days drawing, painting, and studying the way fabric draped across a figure.
And one of his teachers made a comment about his treatment of fabric. He had such a great concept, a feel for painting fabric.
And if you notice, his paintings always show a great deal of attention to cloth. He handles cloth in a way that's absolutely magnificent. You can see that in all of the paintings.
In 1913, at the age of 21, De Wit joined a Belgian seminary, Mont César, and took on the name Gregory.
He joined that monastery and not one of the Dutch monasteries because of two things. They were very active in liturgy, especially in Gregorian chant at the time, and in ecumenism. And those two things interested him.
Continuing their long-standing tradition of supporting the arts, the Benedictine order encouraged Gregory to further develop his skills. Gregory studied at the Brussels Academy of Art, throughout Italy, and the Munich Academy, where he took a special interest in glass design. In 1923, Gregory's art was exhibited at The Hague. Records show that over the course of just 1 month, Gregory sold a staggering 45 paintings. Despite his commercial success, Dom Gregory was committed to the monastic life and continued to live in a monastery.
Because it is my life, you see. Art is the most intimate expression of your most intimate life. And why do we have so little, very little, real, deep religious art today? Why have we to go to commercial art stores? Commercial? And what do they paint? Inspiring you? No, not at all. You have to live things, boy. If you like to preach, you have to have it in you. Words, they go over the heads of the people. They don't make anything. It has to come from your soul. It has to go from heart to heart. They feel that. Oh, yes.
For some time, Dom Gregory lived at St. Michael's Abbey in Metten, Germany. This painting of a monastic banquet at St. Michael's depicts Jesus as a servant, bringing drink to the monks.
He had been in a monastery in Europe, but he had come over at the request of the abbot of St. Meinrad Abbey in Indiana.
That abbot had gone to Europe for one of the periodic meetings of all the abbots of the world, and in the course of his travels, he met Gregory De Wit. And he asked him if he could come to the United States to do some painting at his monastery in Indiana.
Probably in the late 30s, and he was working on paintings for their church and their chapter room in the monastery.
De Wit's work in the chapter room explores connections between the Benedictine order, biblical stories, and God as creator of living things of the land and of the water.
Creation is portrayed in the ceiling panels, and how all creation, the fish of the sea, the animals of the earth, the birds of the air, the stars of creation, all have an active role in God's plan for salvation. So Gregory brings that all together.
This painting of St. Meinrad is located in the memorial lobby of the seminary. Like so many of De Wit's paintings, this one exchanges historical accuracy for symbolic truth. St. Meinrad never actually came to America, but his monastic community did, and it had a tremendous influence on Native Americans through missionary work. This portrait of St. Benedict also includes a self-portrait of the artist in the lower right-hand corner. While the others around him seem to be concentrating on liturgy, De Wit seems to be distracted by Benedict's raven. Notice the painting of Virgin and Child on his desk and his open watercolor set by his feet. While working at the Arch Abbey, De Wit painted this mural depicting Christ the apple tree. For reasons uncertain, the community eventually decided to cover over the painting with wood paneling. Today, these rare photos are the only way to see his art.
Fortunately, to my understanding, the work itself is not damaged. You just can't see it because it was covered over. The point is, theologically, is making a connection between the cross and the apple tree from the Garden of Eden. And so that fateful bite out of the apple that brought death to the world, now that tree is planted anew in the cross of Christ. And so he's now pouring out his blood, his flesh and blood, for us to bite into that and receive everlasting life. So one tree brought death, a new tree brings life. And it's the same thing that St. Paul talks about, is the first Adam brought death to the world. Christ is the second Adam, the new Adam, and he brings life.
Dom Gregory also painted a small prayer chapel in the private residence of the Archbishop of Indiana. Throughout the space, he focuses on figures whose lives served as signposts pointing to the arrival of the Messiah. The ceiling depicts Adam, who was of God, Eve, the mother of all living, Daniel, the highly esteemed, King David, whose house would raise the horn of salvation, King Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah, and the prophet Isaiah, who declared that a virgin would bear a son, whose name would be Emmanuel. The left wall depicts the Annunciation to the Blessed Virgin. The banner reads, "By the power of the Holy Spirit," and continues with the words on the right wall, "He was made man," along with a depiction of the Nativity. The rear wall depicts Christ over the doorway, surrounded by angels and holding a wreath. Dom Gregory signed this dedication, "In the glory of the Word incarnate is this shrine given."
So he came to the United States. Shortly after he arrived, the war broke out. And so returning to Belgium was not an option.
The war in Europe broke out, and so he was at least 10 years before he could go back to Europe. He just came to do a job, then got stuck here.
And it so happened in, I think it was 1940 or 41, that our pastor at Sacred Heart, Dominic Blasco, went up to St. Meinrad for a retreat. And he saw Gregory's work. And because Gregory's work was inspired so much by the Byzantine mosaics of Sicily, which is where Father Blasco was from, he was very intrigued by it. He was in the middle of planning the construction of Sacred Heart Church, and that's when he commissioned Gregory to come down to Baton Rouge to do the paintings for Sacred Heart. Initially, he was commissioned to do the Christ in Majesty that's over the apse, and from there it grew, and he did all these other paintings.
De Wit's overwhelming Christ in Majesty in the apse of the church has been known to garner strong reactions.
It scared me to death.
Oh, by far the Christ in Majesty over the altar is the most memorable painting in Sacred Heart. It really sets the tone for the whole interior. It's based on the Byzantine Pantocrators, which Pantocrator means all-powerful. And so it really relates to the heritage of our pastor and our Italian parishioners. Of course, there are many people who, when you tell them that you're a parishioner at Sacred Heart, they say, "Oh, that's the church with the big scary Jesus."
There used to be a story that ran around that if children misbehaved in class too much, they would send them over to the church for a half an hour and make them look at that painting. Oh, the eyes look straight at you, and the eyes are just huge. I mean, the scale, I think, has something to do with it. The eyes are just really, really large, like they're almost like 18 inches across, I think, something like that.
Particularly our younger parishioners talk about how they don't find him scary. They find him very powerful, but that is comforting because that power is on our side. And I think that is what Dom Gregory was attempting to portray in this piece.
Greeting parishioners at the entrance of the church are two gargantuan portraits, St. Peter on the left and St. Paul on the right. Located in the church's narthex is the old baptistry, where there's a mural depicting John the Baptist utilizing bold outlines characteristic of De Wit's work. The narthex also contains a depiction of the appearance of the Sacred Heart to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. Contrasting with this painting is De Wit's very unique Pietà. The hellish background, grieving mother, and kneeling soldier call to mind ideas about love, war, and sacrifice. But not all parishioners thought that De Wit or his work were an appropriate fit for the church.
Gregory occasionally liked to smoke when he painted, and the fact that he was in church did not deter him.
Even though he and Father Blasco were great friends, some of the assistant pastors were not that crazy about Dom Gregory. I think because he was at this point in time no longer living in a monastery, but just in a rectory, he felt he had a lot more freedom. He went out a lot at night. People invited him to dinner. He'd come in really, really late.
At some point, a butt or two fell down to the floor of the church, and they were still using the space below that. Services were being conducted every day. And at one point, the prior discovered one of these cigarette butts on the floor and really chewed Gregory out for that.
Eventually, they moved him and his studio to what was then called the Sacred Heart camp, which was out on the airline highway, because they had to get him out of the rectory because there was just too much conflict with him living there.
This depiction of the washing of Jesus' feet includes a crude caricature of Father Blasco himself.
The finger that's pointing down toward Jesus and the woman actually has too many joints in it. He could be very difficult. How much of it was just cultural differences? He had come from Europe, he was sophisticated and educated, and he was coming to a really small town where people were just not accustomed to the sorts of things that he was into.
Personally, he always stirred up strong reactions. There were people who liked him, and there were people who just could not stand him.
Art is the right way of doing the things which had to be done. Very simple. But to do a thing right, you have to use your mind, your brain.
One painting in Sacred Heart that's seen its share of controversy is the depiction of the Samaritan woman at the well, confronted by Jesus for being unfaithful in marriage.
The Samaritan woman at the well was I think the last painting that Dom Gregory did at Sacred Heart. And as you look at it, you'll see that the Samaritan woman is showing us a great deal of her leg. And many people, they were already upset about Dom Gregory's work. It was so different from anything they had ever seen, the people that didn't like his work. And they were complaining to the pastor about, essentially he's painting this pornographic thing in our church.
Well, the woman at the well was standing there and, of course, long skirt, but molded over her thigh. And the superior of the Sisters of the School there at Sacred Heart came in and she objected to that particular thing. And he was supposed to have said, "Well, sister, the woman at the well was not a nun."
Eventually, the people who didn't like it got the upper hand.
And Father Blasco came to Dom Gregory. Now, Father Blasco and Dom Gregory were great friends, but he was very frank with him. He said, "There are people in this parish who love you, and there are people in this parish who hate you. There is no in-between.
I'm sorry, it's either you or me, so it's got to be you. You're fired."
You'll notice also that the woman's leg is kind of painted now the same color as her dress, and that may have been a way that Dom Gregory sort of toned it down for people's sensibilities.
Still unable to return home and recently let go from Sacred Heart, De Wit focused his creativity on smaller works of art, many of which are housed in private collections today.
Gregory did I Am the Vine, You Are the Branches. It's Christ surrounded by a grapevine. And it's superimposed, that image of Christ is superimposed on a wood panel of the floor plan of the Abbey Church. At the Abbey, there are side altars down the nave of the church. So the board that is Christ the Vine had all those altars diagrammed, and each peg hole had a time associated with it. And prior would assign the different priests of the monastery which altar was theirs for that day, where they were supposed to be celebrating their private mass with these little pegs.
Dom Gregory often would come to dinner at my grandparents' house. To give you an idea of his personality, he kind of said whatever came to mind. And the first time he came to dinner at my grandmother's house, she was not the best housekeeper, but she had cleaned up the living room and the dining room. But nothing would do, but Dom Gregory had to go back into the kitchen to greet her and thank her and so forth. And of course, it was a total mess in there. It was chaos. The ironing board was still up, and laundry was in various stages around the place. And he said, "The further back you get in this house, the messier it is," which was very true. And later he did a small watercolor for her called the Madonna of the Ironing Board, which is a wonderful little picture of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, with the Virgin Mary is ironing a pair of khaki pants, which we always said those were my grandfather's khaki pants.
While he usually stuck with traditional subject matter, De Wit would continue to draw parallels between biblical characters and modern history. This wonderful portrayal of Madonna and Child depicts the holy pair on a southern slave plantation.
From what I understand from stories that have been handed down, Gregory had a really difficult time understanding American South prejudice against Black people, and found it disgraceful, especially within the context of Christianity.
De Wit chose to paint this piece on celtech, a byproduct of sugarcane. An examination of the Christ child's leg reveals what appears to be lacerations, an obvious analogy between the scourging of Christ and the scourging of slaves. For an uncertain period of time, De Wit traveled the country painting Stations of the Cross in various Catholic churches.
He would travel a lot. He would go to North Texas, and he took a few days off. He had friends that he had made among the clergy, and I know he did some work in California some summers.
These stations, painted in St. Bridget's Church of San Diego, are unique, portraying Christ's suffering in a continuous fashion.
But one of the most impressive works that Gregory did that are Stations of the Cross are in California at St. Bridget's, where it's one continuous painting. They're not separate panels, but just a flow of continual action, which I think is really part of Gregory's theology, that our salvation is one flow, one movement, one work. The Christ event itself, from birth to resurrection, is one movement. It's a long arc. And there is no resurrection without the incarnation. There's no resurrection without the crucifixion. There's no crucifixion without the Last Supper.
Further, it has been said that one of the soldiers torturing Christ was modeled after Adolf Hitler. St. John the Baptist Catholic Church brought Gregory to New Orleans, where he painted these Stations of the Cross. The church also houses paintings depicting major events from the life of John the Baptist. The naming of John, the baptism of Jesus, the beheading of John, and the presentation of John's head to King Herod. In the same city, De Wit was hired to paint the Stations of the Cross for St. Raphael the Archangel Catholic Church, which today is known as Transfiguration of the Lord. With these paintings, Dom Gregory forgoes his typical bold outlines and creates a more realistic rendering of his figures, even while maintaining exaggerated postures and facial expressions. Mere miles away, De Wit also painted the Stations of the Cross at St. Pius X. Unlike his typically large work, De Wit constrains these stations onto small wooden panels. Each station tightly focuses on a single particular aspect of the suffering of Christ, leading the viewers into specific meditation. Critics have noted that De Wit's work in these stations appears crude when compared to the rest of his work, yet some suggest that De Wit's stylistic choices intentionally reflect the suffering of Christ.
Well, the war was still going on. It was impossible for him still to return to Europe. Our abbot heard about the situation and sent word to him, if you need a place to stay, you'll be welcome here. And so he came. He came here just for a place to stay. He ended up by finding a place to paint. He actually started doing works within a month or two. He did, first of all, 2 large portraits of our first 2 abbots. But he was already looking at this church, which was completely whitewashed on the inside. And he asked the abbot, I really would like the opportunity to paint the church. And the abbot said, quite judiciously, why don't you paint the refectory first?
In the refectory, De Wit painted the order's founder, Saint Benedict. Here he depicts Christ, the Prince of Peace. Christ is portrayed as a youth without a beard, yet the wounds from the suffering on the cross remain visible on his right hand. He is also depicted as a musician with panpipes draped over his arm.
Now, Dom Gregory didn't really like people to watch him while he was painting.
My parents came to visit. They didn't come very often, but this was about Thanksgiving time. I brought them in to see the monks' dining room, and I was showing them the scaffolding and telling them what Gregory De Wit was going to do and what he was doing. And a voice comes from the top floor of the scaffolding. It says, "Silence, I'm working." So I profusely apologized and took the party elsewhere.
Sometime after finishing this painting, the war in Europe had ended. Dom Gregory returned home for 2 years, but the thought of painting the church never left his mind.
That first row of paintings with Adam and Eve, it took so long, he felt that he would never get finished. So he left at that point.
While in Europe, De Wit found an artist who would return with him to America to assist with his paintings.
And it wasn't until he came back, bringing with him the young artist from Geneva, Switzerland, Milo Pius, that he redesigned the other panels in a much more simple form, with foliage for the earth, with waves, stylized waves for the water. Well, they were like any two people who work together, have confidence in each other. They were very frank, and there were little arguments that went on once in a while.
He was afraid of heights. And he had a magnificent scaffolding installed. That itself was a work of art. And he wanted it so that he could get up onto that scaffolding without climbing a ladder. So they had to install steps for him to get up there. And he wanted the platform carpeted because he didn't want to see between the cracks down to the floor below. Milo liked to tease him because Milo could make the whole thing shake. That would get Gregory all excited, because I guess he didn't like heights.
Sadly, water damage has claimed many of the panels in the ceiling of the refectory.
Above you and behind you in the ceiling tile, among the animals, there are 2 donkeys there.
There were a couple of people in the community here that he didn't get along with.
Jackasses, you might call them. And they are right over the place at the table where 2 old Germans who were against everything, including having a Dutchman paint the dining room. That's where he placed the painting, over the place where those 2 sat, with the implication, of course, of jackasses.
Moving past the incredible ceiling celebrating God the Creator, viewers can enjoy the world's largest depiction of the Last Supper. Sharp-eyed viewers might notice modern silverware, salt and pepper shakers, and even an ashtray.
I think of it as he liked to dissolve the psychological distance between the viewer and reality that the painting represents.
The story goes that a seminarian was there, seeing De Wit paint, and made a comment that if you're having this nice party, you should at least have some salt and pepper on the table for the guests to use. So Gregory put them in. But here again, it's a matter of Gregory wanting to make that event, that Christ event that happened all those years ago, seem relevant to today. So he ties in what is going on in the place at the time, the meals for the monks, to what Christ did at the time. So the story continues. Christ is part of this meal that we are eating now. So he has the same things on his table that we have on our tables.
Newspapers from the period reveal that De Wit wasn't shy about announcing that his Last Supper was 5 feet wider than Da Vinci's. In this painting, and throughout the rest of the dining hall, Dom Gregory portrays scenes in which biblical characters are interacting with food. Here, a Jewish family participates in the first Passover as described in the book of Exodus. It has been said that De Wit was attempting to convey a sense of salvation through eating. Moses and the Israelites partake in manna. Moses draws life-sustaining water from a rock. Jacob steals Esau's blessing as Rebekah has prepared Isaac's favorite meal.
And as I always say in my talks about art, art is the most intimate expression of the most intimate life. If you don't live it, you cannot give it. As the Lord said, Nemo dat quod non habet, nobody can give what he has not. So first you have to live it in your soul, in your brain, most in your soul. It has to be alive in yourself.
When he wasn't painting, De Wit would spend his creative time sculpting, drawing cartoons, and planning larger artistic works.
He had a studio. It had actually originally been built as a place for 2 monks who had contracted tuberculosis to convalesce.
That's what it was built for. And it hadn't been used for anything for a long time.
In his studio, De Wit designed 2 sculptures, which were carved by Bavarian artist Josef Neustifter. The first was of Saint Joseph and the child Jesus. The second of Saint Benedict. De Wit also coordinated with a group of nuns in Germany to produce vestments of his design. This vestment depicts the symbols of the 12 apostles on the back. The front is designed to look like the breastplate worn by a Jewish high priest, similar to the one worn by the priest featured in De Wit's Betrothal of Mary and Joseph. This elaborate design is reminiscent of the 42nd Psalm, comparing David's longing for God to the way a deer pants for streams of water. The text in Latin translates as the font of life and fire of love. The Abbey continues to use these vestments during Pentecost. Today, De Wit's studio functions as a garden house on the Abbey's ground.
By the time he finished the refectory, which itself took about 5 years, people were ready to let him work on the church.
The artwork in St. Joseph Abbey is widely considered De Wit's best, his magnum opus. Milo also assisted in the completion of the painting of the Abbey. His work is distinct from De Wit's, but in many ways it emulates his style. Fortunately, the Abbey archives have preserved the only known audio recording of De Wit, allowing us the opportunity to hear the artist directly explain his work.
Now, the main idea presiding to this church, my dear boys and friends, is the unity in Christ. A church, as it is here built, the building itself, is made of stones, all put together. And that is only a symbol and an image of what we are in Christ. One. I should not even say we are members of Christ, we are more than that. We are one with Christ. As he said himself at the Last Supper, as he prayed to his Father, that they might be one as you, Father, and I are one. And therefore, as I said before, those saints on the wall are not just outstanding of us. No, we are with them. One in Christ. Don't forget that. And then I come to the main idea. Christ is the head. Christ is everything. And we are in him. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And in the Alpha, in the beginning of him, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, that we say every day so, just quickly. We don't think about it. Let it penetrate you. Don't say just little prayers, but penetrate yourself with the great ideas of God and Christ. How will you give it later on to people if you have it not yourself, if you have not lived it? Have you ever thought about it, that there was a time that there was no creation at all, and ex nihilo, out of nothing, he created light, the earth, the moon, we, animals, birds, and he himself is the rising sun, coming up every day. And therefore I put Christ the Creator there, and the rising sun who illuminates every man coming in this world. And the Word became flesh, he himself came into creation, in his own creation, et sui eam non recipiens, and his own did not receive him. But vidimus gloria meus, we saw his glory again, and we see his glory again every day, in the beauty of his creation. So there is the beginning, where we came from. Then on the other side, and there is Christ, the Omega, where we have to come to. All flesh to thee shall come. All thing has to come back to its Creator. The glorious Christ there. And therefore there are all kind of people, crippled and blind, and the Holy Father, and the bishop, and a sister, and a military man, a big businessman with a cigar in his mouth, and myself, poor sinner too. We are not just spirits floating around. The soul of every saint was created. The soul of the Blessed Virgin was created. Don't forget that. So there comes on the wall the invisible creation of that mystical body of Christ, his church. One body in him. I hope you catch my idea, presiding to the idea of the composition of this church, you see, boys. Don't read silly stories and comic strips and all that kind of stuff. Poof. Penetrate yourself with the great ideas. But you have to think it over. We got a brain for that, to think something at least. If you are sleepy in the morning, you come here in the church at 5:30. I see your faces, and you sing so badly. Excuse me. It is so false. Why? Because you have not the Spirit in you. Is it not true? Just sit there sleepy, think about breakfast already. And if it is a free day, you don't think at all. But do that. Get the ideas in you. I am still, boys, for my meditation, if you like to know it, at the first words of our credo. I believe still in God the Father Almighty, from the Creator of the visible and invisible things. That is still my meditation. And I don't go further. But you have to think it over. We got a brain for that, to think something at least. You see, I hope you have understood something of what I meant with this church. And I beg your pardon talking about myself. So don't think about me if you go to the church. Think about yourself and the unity you have with Christ, and that you are one with all those saints. Your souls are that invisible creation. And we came back from him all. If we are bishops or popes or colored men or white men, we come home from the Alpha and we go back home to the Omega.
Gregory has a real knack for painting strength and grace combined together. It's most obvious, I think, in the Theotokos, the Virgin altar at St. Joseph Abbey, where he has the Virgin in very traditional position of prayer, and she appears as a column in a building. If you think about a column, they can be very graceful, well tapered and elongated and just rising up. But a column has to be very strong to do what it's meant to do architecturally. In engineering, it has to hold up this building. And that's really how the Virgin appears to me at St. Joseph Abbey. He just captures that strength of a column and beautiful grace of God's incarnate love, as she is the vessel of that incarnate love. While he was working in the church, a bishop came to visit and was admiring Gregory's work and was just saying how beautiful it was. And Gregory said, "But if you could only see it in my mind, it's even more beautiful."
When he was painting the church, he took a break and walked out by the lake, as we call it, next to the church. And there was a little boy there, not a seminarian, a much younger child. And he asked Gregory, "Are you one of the priests?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "What do you do around here?" And Gregory says, "I'm painting the church." And the little boy says, "What color?"
Some other person was admiring Gregory's work at the Abbey, looking up at the apse, and there's an image of Adam and Eve before the fall, so they had no clothes on. And so this bishop, or whoever he was admiring the work. He said, "But you should cover Adam and Eve." And Gregory said, "But you go into churches in Europe and there's naked people being shown." And the bishop said, "But that is art." And Gregory is like, "And this? What is this?"
And I said to Father Eggart, I asked him permission to go away here. I said, "Father Eggart, I have given to you 10 years, because first in the refectory and then here, the best of my soul to you. May I go now and give a little, the best of my soul to myself and to God."
Upon completing his work at St. Joseph Abbey in 1955, Dom Gregory De Wit packed his bags and sailed to Switzerland to become a hermit.
What he had next to his hermitage that he was very pleased with, he was left speechless when he arrived there. He was so pleased with the accommodations that were made for him. A small chapel was built next to the hermitage, and he would celebrate the Eucharist there every day, and the local village ladies that were very fond of him would be there for the celebration of the Eucharist with him. It wasn't a parish, it wasn't a full-fledged parish church, but just a small chapel that he had, which he also painted there.
These rare photos capture some of Gregory's final works. The triptych at the front of the chapel includes a self-portrait of the artist, kneeling below his namesake, St. Gregory the Great. As always, his palette is nearby. The center panel depicts the Blessed Virgin and Child surrounded by the mountains of Switzerland. The final panel depicts Saint Emilius.
He wrote a memoir shortly after he left the United States, in the year after he left here. He wrote it in Dutch, and he came back to the United States in the hopes of finding a publisher that would have it translated into English and published. But all the publishers, he actually sailed to New York. All the publishers in New York said, "Why don't you have it translated into English and then we'll look at it."
He was in New York and flagged a cab, and in that cab, lo and behold, was Maria von Trapp, of the famous story from The Sound of Music. And they began talking as they were taking their cab ride, sharing the cab ride. And when she found out that Gregory had been to Baton Rouge, she was telling him about this church she went to, and it had the most hideous paintings in it. Gregory told the cab driver to stop immediately, and he got out of the car and says to the Maria von Trapp, "I do not cast my pearls before swine."
De Wit's memoir, which he entitled I'll Never Be Famous, was never published.
I think it's tongue-in-cheek. I think to some extent he would like to have been famous. He wouldn't have minded being famous, but he would also say, but that's not going to happen. And people who knew him better than I know him, of course, often say he really was humble. He wasn't modest, but he was humble, in the sense that he knew that he was gifted, but he knew that his gifts came from God, and was always ready to tell you that.
Even late in his life, Dom Gregory maintained a good humor about his own mortality, as depicted in this self-portrait. Dom Gregory De Wit passed away peacefully in his sleep on November 22nd, 1978.
Well, so if you come into church, don't think about me, the crazy fellow. I told Father Abbot, if I die, put on my tomb, here lies Gregory the Crazy. One thing is sure, he was never lazy.
So what is Gregory's legacy? In this beginning part of the 21st century, there has been in Roman Catholic circles a real interest in Eastern iconography. And I think Gregory is kind of an interesting bridge to Western art and traditional Eastern iconography. But I think now, perhaps partially, which is the evolution of art in general, and we've gone through so many stylistic periods in Western art history, from complete total abstraction of late Malevich and Mark Rothko, of just colors, color fields, Joseph Albers, to super realism of Chuck Close, and now how Gregory kind of melds so many things to get together, going back to ancient styles of iconography from the first centuries of the church, and brings them to a new context now.
We have to pass through that, and we have to pass during our life through that immense church, through the corridors of that immense church, which is Christ. I thank you very much for your patience and your attention. May God bless you.